No one would have believed in the middle of the 20th century that human affairs were being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's. Yet, across the gulf of space, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic regarded our Earth with envious eyes, slowly and surely drawing their plans against us. It did not occur to mankind that a swift fate might be hanging over us, or that from the blackness of outer space we were being scrutinized and studied, until, during a pleasant summer season,
By the third day of the calamity, those fortunate enough to have been sufficiently far away from the initial attacks fled the devastation of their once great cities for the temporary refuge of the mountains and prairies, swamps and woodlands. As the roads and highways became littered with abandoned vehicles, as fuel was exhausted and bridges destroyed, people crowded the remaining transportation or simply walked. But they continued their trek away from the invaders. Eventually, informal convoys formed. This is the story of one such caravan. As some remnants of the population of the Los Angeles basin made their way eastward into the foothills, a small National Guard detachment and a few remnants of local law enforcement managed to keep some semblance of order. The policemen, in their now tattered uniforms, did their best to present a professional police presence to help reassure the survivors that society had not collapsed and that civility was still required of all. The military detachment was made up of Marines who had orders to recover tanker trucks with their now precious cargo of gasoline. As they sought refuge away from the nightmarish sounds of the battle just across the mountains, they slowly made their way through the mountain roads. But their course, which had initially simply been one of immediate escape, was no longer a random one. For military minds, which were as cool and calculating as those of the attackers, had also been watching, and their observations would soon bear fruit. But for now, the people drove or rode or simply walked away from the terrifying sounds. As a father tries to reassure his terrified children in the back of a truck, he tells them of how he once saw such things as he marched across France in 1944, and told them not to despair, for once the madness had ended, life eventually returned to normal in that faraway land. But he also quietly wondered if France was now also under attack. A mature couple, still looking dignified despite their now tattered clothes, continued to walk with their heads held high. A passenger of a truck stands by, ready to fend off any ruffians who may try to take over their precious transport. A lone man clings to the back of a truck, while others simply ride alongside total strangers with no idea where to go or what to do next. And others simply keep walking. Among the refugees were military aviation personnel that were ordered to flee their stricken airbase after the last of their aircraft were destroyed, their commanders hoping to preserve the skills each man had for a possible future fight. An auto mechanic helps keep an old farm truck going, and his skills are now amongst the most important of all. Each person in this exodus has been ripped away from the story that was their life by an unknown attacker whose face no one has even seen. At best, perhaps a glance at the horrific weapons that attacked them. Were they aliens? Demons of the supernatural? Perhaps it was the Russians, or even angels venting God's wrath on a decadent world. Nobody knew, but everybody wondered. Hungry, tired, dirty, and terrified, they moved along with an almost drone-like demeanor. Whatever meager possessions they had on their persons was now all they had left. Military and civilians intermingled, usually offering each other what little aid and comfort they could. As they entered a large clearing, They were horrified by a new sight: the burnout remains of a small roadside motel, its inhabitants vaporized by the attackers. Clearly the attackers had already been here and moved on, but would they return? Then, although startling at first, there was the comfortingly familiar sound of a helicopter overhead. Its staccato chatter echoed off the valley walls as it settled into a clearing in front of them. Out of it stepped a small team of men, including 2 military policemen and a distinguished-looking middle-aged man in a perfect uniform. Perhaps these men had some morsel of information for the haggard mass, for everyone craved information as much as they needed food and water. A few of the military officers and policemen went forth to speak with these men from the helicopter. The man in charge was a National Guard 2-star general, and he did have much to say. The military, finding its weapons useless against such technology and having realized its inability to stave off this destruction, expanded its mission, prioritizing aiding and directing the seemingly countless caravans of shocked and exhausted people. They commandeered as many strategic assets as they could find, mostly food, fuel, and medicine. With the regular armed forces still valiantly trying to slow the advance of the attackers, the National Guard was assigned the task of aiding an expected tidal wave of refugees. The mission in this area was under command of the general who stood before them. An architect by profession, this bespectacled man understood the need for clear, calm thinking and organization. He began setting up remote way stations with very basic medical facilities, food and water distribution, and fuel for the few vehicles that had made it thus far. With the aid of whatever civilian law enforcement could be mustered, he quickly arranged for a system to be set up. The police, backed up by the military, would direct and control the civilian population. His hope was that the use of civilian police would help reassure the people and add some small modicum of normalcy in the minds of the survivors. As more people told their stories and more observations were made, a picture began to emerge. The invaders, for all of their immense intellect and technology, were prone to predictable patterns. The military commanders may have lacked the weapons to defeat their enemies, but their strategic minds were finding deep flaws in the attackers' plan. In time, it was revealed that these mysterious agents of destruction were not operating like an invasion force by taking and holding ground, but more like an exterminator trying to wipe out an infestation. Once they had sanitized an area, they moved on, never to return. The general decided the best way to save lives was to find areas that the attackers had already been through and establish camps there. As a result, people were sent that way and the military supported them as best it could. Since it was abundantly clear that the attackers had already been through this area, it was decided that this would be the best place to make camp. Supplies were trucked in here and at other remote outposts along the ever-expanding river of refugees. Connected by radio, these outposts also served as collection points for information and intelligence. Food and water were quickly distributed, supplies collected and guarded, and minor improvements were made to the last standing structure to be used as an aid station. Communications were set up, and patrols were sent out to scout the area, as well as forward observation posts to give early warning should the attackers return. The food and water, along with the badly needed rest, buoyed the people's spirits. The semblance of order and structure gave them comfort, and the sight of low-flying fighter jets streaking towards the battle gave them hope. There were many pilots in their group who could not help but notice that they did not see all of the planes return. As night fell, people slept in their clothes with their shoes on, lest they be required to flee on short notice. Despite their fatigue, sleep came with difficulty, for during the night, the sounds and eerie lights of the battle across the mountains raged on. Men's imaginations had to be reined in, as every flash of light seemed to briefly illuminate a nightmare. Sleep came with the darkness, and darkness came with the sleep. Early the next morning, the word came. The decision was made to use the bomb. The idea of using the atomic bomb on American soil had seemed inconceivable only a few days before. Scientists had discovered another weakness in the attackers, and it was not the blast, but the EMP, or electromagnetic pulse, that was output from an atomic blast. They thought that this would destroy the attackers, or at least their machines. Los Angeles, virtually annihilated at this point and still a major area of concentration for the attackers, was chosen. There was also a fear that if this failed, that once the attackers were finished sanitizing the city, they may return to the mountains to follow up on their work. So people would not be safely sheltered by the mountains. Ergo, the order was given for them to face east until after the blast. Many of them sought cover wherever they could find it. It would be some time before the results of the atomic bomb blast could be determined, so the people should be made ready to move in case the bomb was to fail. Vehicles were fueled and loaded with what provisions could be mustered. The people were warned and prepared, and then it was time.
Attention, stand by. 15 seconds. 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
It took some time for the sound to reach the mountains. Once the blast had cleared, everyone mounted the vehicles prepared to move out. Had the bomb worked? Then the radio calls slowly began to come in. The machines fell, never to rise again, but all was not secure. Since the people could not return yet, the decision was made to set up the local stations as refugee camps while the military assessed the situation, but at least a further evacuation would not be required. It was learned that aside from the radiation, a new threat was looming. The attackers' ships had failed, but many of the attackers, scared and hungry, had begun fighting outside of their vehicles. Rumors circulated of the zombified dead being reanimated to fight humans. Other rumors spread about giant monsters, like the one Russia had unleashed on Germany in 1946. There were even wilder rumors of mutated sea creatures ravaging the city. Other stories claimed there were mutated zoo animals on the loose that had fled into the woods and upwards toward the mountains. And all of this was made worse by every manner of terrifying sound that pierced the following night's sky. The explosions of bombs and artillery continued throughout the night as the army kept up its fight in the city. Terrifying shadows reflected on the clouds above the city, which was now a hellscape. Rumors and imaginations ran wild. The outposts were fully manned and a defensive perimeter tightened. But the night passed with little more than frayed nerves and wild imaginations. At daybreak, more assets eventually joined the camp. A helicopter reconnaissance dispelled the stories of giant monsters and zombies in the streets, but the aliens were still fighting as foot soldiers. There were battles still being fought in the city, but this was a threat the military could fight. Yet there was one constant fear that the attackers may break through and follow the exodus of refugees into the hills. The camp was reinforced as much as humanly possible. The battle against the attackers could be heard echoing throughout the next night as well. Everyone had a finger by the trigger. But within the week, the days had become routine, and the nights were becoming ever more quiet, eventually having little more than the chirping of crickets. It was over, and we had won. The guns eventually grew silent, and the word was sent that the enemy was defeated. The radiation levels outside the hot zone were low enough for human occupation, and the enemy had been totally neutralized. People could return home, or to what was left of it. But there was another threat waiting for them upon their return. Without a working government and no infrastructure, the people had to be on guard to protect themselves from themselves.